So you can imagine if you have those two beliefs, bad things are going to happen, number one. And number two, it's going to be unmanageable if they do happen. And the consequences are going to be completely unmanageable if they do happen. You're going to be anxious in social situations. And a lot of the time, those things are just not true, and at the very least, not helpful.
Okay, welcome back to the Become Your Own Therapist podcast, the podcast where I try to put myself out of a job as a clinical psychologist. Today, we are speaking about shyness and social anxiety, and we have a professional who has literally written the book on it. I'm delighted to have Dr. Martin M. Antony, who is a professor in the Department of Psychology at Toronto Metropolitan University and provincial clinical and training lead for the Ontario Structured Psychotherapy Program. Previously, he was founding director of both the Anxiety Treatment and Research Clinic and Psychology Residency Program at St. Joseph's Healthcare Hamilton. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and a past president of the Canadian Psychological Association and the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies. He has published 33 books and over 300 scientific articles and chapters in areas related to cognitive behavior therapy and anxiety-related disorders. He has given more than 425 presentations to audiences across 4 continents and has been interviewed, featured, or quoted more than 450 times in various print, radio, television, and online media outlets, including BBC News, CBC, Chatelaine Magazine, CNN, CTV, The Globe and Mail, National Post, New York Times, O, which is Oprah's magazine, Prevention Magazine, Reader's Digest, Scientific American Mind, Toronto Star, USA Today, Washington Post, and many others. So, Dr. Antony, thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm sure it'll be a great discussion because you've been featured in so many mediums that allow connection between the scientific knowledge and the broader population. But today we're focusing on shyness and social anxiety, for which you've written a book on.
Great. Yeah, a lot of my work has really been focused on translating what we know from the evidence into a format that the general public can use. So this is a great forum to sort of continue that work.
Yeah. I was just going to say it's a good fit. So yeah, thank you for being here. And I actually found your book quite useful in terms of the way it was structured. It sort of walks you through, from the broad sort of concepts right down to the practicals and nitty-gritty, and then a future plan. So I think I'll actually rely on the book's structure in guiding this conversation. And maybe we can start with the title of the first chapter, which is What is Shyness and Social Anxiety?
Yeah, so I would think about shyness as a personality trait. It's something that a lot of us can relate to. In fact, in some surveys, up to 70% of people describe themselves as shy in certain situations or certain times of their lives. So it's a fairly common kind of experience that people have. It's probably closely related to what we sometimes call introversion, so a tendency to be just a little bit more inward and less sort of, as opposed to being more extroverted, and so a lot of us feel less comfortable in social situations than others do. So that's kind of shyness. Social anxiety is a tendency to feel anxious in social situations, and that also overlaps with shyness. So people who are very shy are also anxious in social situations often. So they may feel nervous, or if they have to go to a party, they may kind of be dreading it a little bit. But I would say social anxiety is broader than just shyness. So I often think of 2 different types of social anxiety. So one is interpersonal anxiety, and that overlaps very much with shyness. So that's anxiety around situations where you're interacting with others. So starting up a conversation or keeping a conversation going. For example, meeting new people, dating, those are all interpersonal situations. But another kind of social situation that people may feel anxious in is performance situations where you're the center of attention, where people are observing you, and sort of the classic kind of common example there is public speaking. A lot of us have difficulty public speaking, but that's kind of different than shyness. You may be nervous public speaking, but you might not be shy at all. If you're at a party, you might be very comfortable. I've also seen people who are very shy, very anxious in interpersonal situations, but they can get on stage and sing and dance and perform. So the two often go together, but they don't necessarily go together. So I would see social anxiety as really encompassing both of those kinds of situations. And then the last thing I would mention is social anxiety disorder. And this is a problem where people have social anxiety at a level that's interfering with their life, or that's causing problems for them, or that is bothering them in a significant way. So most of us, probably everybody almost, experiences social anxiety from time to time. And again, that's just feeling nervous in a social situation where we might be observed or evaluated by others. With social anxiety, again, it's the severity of that feeling, the frequency, the intensity, and the impact of that feeling on our lives that makes it a problem.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so is it fair to say then that social anxiety, you call it social anxiety disorder only when it's the nervousness is actually getting in the way of some aspect of a lived life?
Yeah, and it has to be also out of proportion to the situation. So it has to be excessive or more than what most people would experience. And it wouldn't be unusual if you're on your wedding day to feel anxious. That wouldn't be social anxiety disorder. So it has to be out of proportion to what most people would experience. And it has to be a problem. It has to be interfering in some way, or has to be bothering you or preventing you from doing things that you want to do.
Okay, great. I think social, in my own practice, social anxiety, it crops up quite often. So I see a lot of people, and performance anxiety as well, that fear of being the center of attention while on stage or performing some activity. Why do so many people struggle with social anxiety?
Well, it makes sense. When we think about anxiety, it's really there to protect us from possible harm. The reason people are afraid of snakes is because snakes in some situations can be dangerous. People are afraid of driving and heights and spiders and water and storms. All of these things are potentially dangerous, and social situations are also dangerous potentially, and they're not life-threatening, but they're dangerous in terms of our social functioning. So if you are judged negatively by others, then there are potentially costs to that. You may not get the job that you want. You may have difficulty getting into relationships. So we all want to be judged positively by others in order to prevent those negative things from happening. And for some people, that concern about being judged by others is more than it should be, or more than what's helpful. But it's evolution is probably we have evolved to be careful in social situations and to want to make a good impression on others, because it helps us in the end to be more successful in our relationships, in our work, and so on. So that's probably how it's come about over time, that people would develop this sort of trait, this desire. But again, like any kind of trait, there are some people who don't have enough of it. We've probably all met people who could probably benefit from being a little bit more concerned about what other people think of them. And then people who have a little bit too much of it for their own good, so that it does cause problems for them. So like all traits, it's kind of normally distributed in the population, with most of us in the middle somewhere, but then people on both extremes.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I'll also just add that there are other factors that contribute to it. So we know that learning or experiences play a role. So, for example, if I've been severely teased growing up, we know that that's correlated with heightened levels of social anxiety later on. So people have had sort of traumatic social experiences that can lead to social anxiety later on. We know that it doesn't have to be specific traumas. It may be sort of a history over many years of being told certain things that reinforce social fears, for example, growing up in a household where parents are constantly telling you you need to be very careful how you come across to others, because if you're not, then they're going to judge you, and people may really take that to heart. Modeling, so we may have others in our lives who are very socially anxious, who avoid social situations, and we may learn that kind of avoidance behavior by watching others. So those are all examples of experiences that contribute to heightened social anxiety. And our biology may also play a role in this. So we know that there are certain brain chemicals, neurotransmitters that are correlated with anxiety. And we also know that really from a very young age, infants, some infants are what we call more behaviorally inhibited than others. And all that means is behavioral inhibition is a tendency to avoid kind of novel situations. So, some infants, when a stranger comes into the room, they start crying. Other infants, when the stranger walks into the room, they light up. They're very excited to see that. And it's not like they've had all these negative experiences or anything. They're brand new infants. And yet we are born probably with these temperaments to respond to new situations in different ways. And as it turns out, infants who are high in behavioral inhibition are more likely to grow up with problems with anxiety down the road. So these sort of temperaments that we're born with can influence problems later as well. So it really is a mix of behavioral learning kinds of factors and our biological makeup, our genetics that contribute to the problem.
Mm-hmm. And in that, I'm hearing that there is an evolutionary reason. It serves a function. There's almost a usefulness to it, a baby in the bathwater. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, yeah. So if we had no anxiety in social situations, you'd end up getting yourself into trouble all the time. You would say things that offend other people or put other people off. You would maybe in a situation at a funeral, you'd be, laughing and talking and interrupting. So it's our in job interviews, you might say things that are inappropriate, and it's our that desire to be safe in those situations, socially or interpersonally safe, that protects us from doing those things and ultimately helps us to succeed and survive.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. If we move into this, you've spoken a bit about it being too little. If we move into the space of it being a little too much, causing some dysfunction, being out of proportion, what do you usually see in your research or practice or whatever it is in terms of the common dysfunction that it causes in people's lived lives?
So it really can affect just about every aspect of people's functioning. So when we think about social situations, we think about often things like parties and dating and things like that and interviews. But really almost any situation where there are other people around can be a social situation. So in extreme cases, people may have a lot of trouble even leaving their homes because, as soon as they walk out the door, their neighbors might see them and might talk to them. They may have difficulty going into stores or shopping malls and supermarkets and things because other people may stare at them and may judge them in those situations. So it can really affect a wide range of situations. The common ones that people fear and avoid, if we think about interpersonal situations, those would be things like dating, meeting new people, striking up a conversation, maintaining a conversation, going to a party, eating, going out for dinner with other people, anywhere where you might have to kind of interact with other people, making small talk can be very difficult. In terms of performance situations where you might be observed, eating with others can also be a performance situation. It's not just necessarily the interaction, but there are aspects of it where people feel like they're being watched. Maybe when they're holding their knife or their fork or their glass and their hands are shaking, people might notice that. So people might avoid for that reason as well. Same with writing in front of others. People are sometimes afraid that their hands will shake and people will notice that. Using public bathrooms can be a social situation that people feel they could be judged. So we see men, for example, who are afraid to use a urinal in a public bathroom where other people are present. Public speaking, again, is a big one. Occasionally, professional musicians who can't perform in front of others will come for treatment because of that. Working out in a gym and having other people watch. Any situation, again, where you feel like other people might be watching potentially can be a feared situation. So people end up taking jobs that are not, that they're overqualified for. They end up turning down jobs that involve having to do public speaking. They may avoid applying for jobs that involve interviews. They may have difficulty making friends and keeping friends because they won't spend time with those friends. Dating situations may be difficult. So people are more likely to be single if they have elevated social anxiety than if they don't. And again, all of these things are on a continuum from very, very mild to very, very severe. So there's lots of people in between. Many people with social anxiety disorder who are married and who are working, but within their job and within their relationship is causing problems. So maybe they're married and their spouse wants to socialize more and they don't want to, so it ends up causing conflict in the relationship. So it can affect people in more subtle ways or in more extreme ways. I'll also just quickly mention that social anxiety can be a feature of other problems as well. So people with depression may avoid social situations and may be anxious in social situations more because they're afraid people are going to notice the features of their depression, and maybe they'll be embarrassed that they haven't been working in a while, or they're afraid that people are going to judge the fact that they've been doing less because they're depressed or something. We wouldn't call that social anxiety disorder. With social anxiety disorder, we want to make sure that the social anxiety is not exclusively related to another psychological issue that people are struggling with. So if somebody with obsessive compulsive disorder is avoiding social situations because they don't want people to notice their hand washing, for example, that's not social anxiety disorder. That's just social anxiety that's secondary to the obsessive compulsive disorder. So for OCD, for social anxiety disorder, it has to kind of be a separate kind of problem.
It's really dawning on me just how a problem like this can penetrate almost every aspect of your life, because our lives are so immensely social.
Yeah. And I hope this is helping to dispel the myth that social anxiety disorder is just kind of medicalizing shyness. I remember when Paxil, which is paroxetine, I think in other countries, some other countries it's called Aeropax. But anyway, and maybe there are other names for it as well, but it's paroxetine is the generic name. I remember when it was launched as Paxil in North America, there were lots of TV commercials saying, "Are you allergic to people? If so, you may want to talk to your doctor about Paxil." And there was a lot of criticism in the media that, now they're calling shyness a medical disorder. What's next? I hope that it's clear that in the case of social anxiety disorder, it's not different from shyness, but it's sort of the extreme end of shyness. So again, it's perfectly normal to be anxious in social situations. That's not a disorder. It's only a disorder when it's causing problems, and at that level, it is something that people do benefit from getting some help from. So I don't think we want to trivialize the kinds of problems that people can be having sometimes.
Yes, I agree, and I think with the whole medicalization debate, I think what's helpful there is focusing on what the person needs. If this is affecting their life, why shouldn't they be offered tools to help them out?
Exactly.
Yeah. Great. So speaking of tools, maybe we can jump into that. And you've mentioned medication, and maybe we can have a brief chat about it later. But I'd like to focus on the population who don't have access to a therapy or medication. For those people, they're struggling, they're noticing, okay, through this conversation, it seems like I might have some social anxiety. It might be a disorder. It is affecting my life. Where should that person, where could they get started in terms of helping themselves?
Yeah, so there are really a few different approaches that have been found to be useful for social anxiety. So one of them is cognitive therapy or cognitive approaches. And what cognitive, again, I'm using the term therapy, but it can still be you can do your own cognitive therapy. It doesn't have to involve a therapist. What that involves is identifying and changing the beliefs that contribute to the social anxiety. So a lot of people with social anxiety are making predictions about bad things that will happen. So my anxiety symptoms are going to show, for example. People will notice them. People will judge me because of that. People will think bad things about me. I'm not going to get the job if I apply for it. I'm going to look like a complete. I'll look completely anxious if I go for a job interview, and people will notice that. And there are two kinds of types of thoughts that people have that contribute to anxiety, excessive anxiety. One is the prediction that something bad is going to happen. I'm going to be judged. I'm going to make a fool of myself. People will think I'm an idiot. People will think I don't know what I'm talking about. I will look extremely anxious to other people, those sorts of predictions. The second, and we call that probability overestimation or sort of assuming that the worst is going to happen, that kind of thing. The second kind of thinking that we see in anxiety problems, including social anxiety, is what we call catastrophic thinking. And this term is used in different ways, but in this context, what I mean is the tendency to exaggerate the importance of something. So if I was to look anxious in front of other people, that would be a disaster. Or if people were to notice my anxiety, I couldn't cope with that. So you can imagine if you have those two beliefs, bad things are going to happen, number one. And number two, it's going to be unmanageable if they do happen. And the consequences are going to be completely unmanageable if they do happen. You're going to be anxious in social situations. And a lot of the time, those things are just not true, and at the very least, not helpful. There's lots of situations where the first belief may be true. Maybe you are going to get anxious. Maybe people will judge you, because the reality is we all judge one another all the time. Everybody gets judged. But it's not that important. And there could be other situations where whatever you're predicting is going to happen just is unlikely to happen. So what we want people to do, rather than to assume that their predictions and their beliefs are facts, we want them to treat them as guesses and look at the evidence. So I might ask myself, is it necessarily the case that if somebody seems nervous during a presentation that everyone's going to judge them negatively? Have I ever seen someone look nervous during a presentation, maybe during an Oscars acceptance speech, for example? And did I think horrible things about them? Probably not. I might empathize with them, actually, if anything. Would it be unusual on a first date to feel really nervous? There are people who don't feel at all nervous on the first date, but I think for many of us, we would feel nervous on the first date. I know when I'm interviewing people for our graduate program or for a job, I kind of expect them to be a little bit anxious. I've seen people who seem too comfortable, and it makes me nervous. I remember one person who came into my office and put his feet up on my desk, and was, just sitting back, completely comfortable. And I thought, if this is how comfortable he is at a job interview, what's he going to be like once he's really comfortable? Whether there'd be issues with boundaries and things like that. So I kind of want to see a little bit of anxiety in a job interview. It's more normative. It tells me this person is going to, again, they're going to appreciate what the boundaries are, and to kind of know. It's suggestive to me of good interpersonal skills to kind of get anxious in certain situations. So we really want people to ask themselves questions. So when you have a particular prediction, so if I ask this person out on a date, they're going to say no, and it's going to be a disaster. To ask yourself, do I know that's necessarily the case? Do I know they're going to say no? And if they do say no, what evidence do I have that it'll be a disaster? Maybe they should say no, and is the fact that they might say no a reason? When I say they should say no, maybe it's normal for people to say no to some requests for dates. You wouldn't expect every request to be met with a positive response. I might ask the question, is that a reason not to take social risks? Maybe it's a reason to take more social risks. I might ask the person, what do you think the odds are of somebody saying yes when, just on average, when somebody asks somebody on a date that they're going to say yes? Maybe it's 1 in 5. I don't know what it is, but if it's 1 in 5, if you take that risk every 2 years, every 10 years, you're going to get a date. On the other hand, if you take that risk several times a week, over the course of a few months, you'll have gone on many dates and maybe end up in a relationship. So the risk of being rejected, you can interpret that as a reason to take more social risks, not a reason to take fewer social risks. In that example, anyway. So the other advantage of taking more social risks is that your skills get better. If someone wants to be a piano player and they're not very good at it, you'd never recommend to them, oh, you should play less often. You'd say, practice. You need to practice more. And just like playing piano, social skills are learned. They're learned through practice, and they're learned through things going wrong. When things don't go wrong, you don't really notice. But when things go wrong, you can think, oh, I did that. It didn't work. What can I do differently next time? So again, social anxiety and being rusty in terms of your social skills, those are not reasons not to do things. Those are reasons to do more socializing and more practicing. And it gets easier. I remember very clearly the first time I ever had to give a professional presentation, 1987 in the spring. And I was presenting some data. I was a research assistant. And I was presenting some data from a study we had done to a professional audience. And I remember my mouth was dry. I kind of had a lot of trouble focusing on what I was saying. It didn't come across well. Apparently, I kept apologizing. I didn't even know I was doing that, but my supervisor said, you don't need to apologize when you're giving talks. I must have done that a few times. I think I was apologizing for the quality of the data or something. I can't remember. So I remember that talk very clearly. And now I've done a lot of public speaking over the years, and it just I've come to enjoy it over time. But it took a while to get there. So again, if I had used that experience as a sign that, public speaking is not for me, I would still be like that every time I had to speak in public. And I'm getting away a little bit from cognitive strategies. I've begun to talk about exposure, which is the kind of confronting feared situations. But coming back to the cognitive strategies, it's all really about questioning your thoughts and looking at evidence, maybe even doing little experiments to test out whether a thought is true. So, for example, if you're convinced that other people are going to notice that you're sweating and they're going to judge you negatively. David Clark is a psychologist in the UK. What he has people do is put water under their arms and go into a meeting and sit like this so people can see they're sweating and see what happens. That's an example of an experiment to test out whether a belief is true. So it's all about learning to think more flexibly, learning to think in a balanced kind of way rather than just thinking in that one anxious kind of way. Another strategy, do you want me to move on to exposure, or are there any questions about cognitive strategies?
Yeah, I think maybe we can dig into just clarify some things under the cognitive strategy. So for the people who are deciding to do this and question what they're thinking, I know for a lot of people, let's say you're about to go to a social event and you're dreading it a bit, and that anxiety starts to surface. It can feel like a vague, sort of misty, just sense that they don't want to go. And then these beliefs that underline it, the catastrophizing or the probability overestimation is sort of like far in the background. But what are some useful questions, or I should say, helpful questions in a situation like that where you have just this misty feeling?
So the first thing is just to recognize that if there is a feeling of anxiety, there's probably some sort of prediction. And it may be unconscious, it may not be sort of the front of your mind, and that's okay. We process information unconsciously all the time. If you think about driving, we've also, when you first learn to drive, you have to think about every little thing that your hand and feet are doing, and you have to look straight ahead, but you also have to make sure your speed isn't too high, and you have to check your blind spot and make sure there's, check your rear view mirror from time to time. There's all this stuff that you need to be paying attention to, and it's all very conscious. After a while, once you've been driving for a while, you do all those things just unconsciously. And it's the same with anxiety, that if you're so used to getting anxious in these situations, the specific predictions may not be obvious to you. So to use cognitive strategies in particular, you do need to be aware of the thoughts. I would try to encourage people to ask themselves, what am I thinking will happen right now in this situation? Is there a social aspect to this? Am I nervous? Because people can be afraid of a party for a lot of different reasons. People may be afraid of the party because it's going to be crowded. They're not going to be able to breathe, and they may have to escape, and people will notice that they have to escape. Or they may be afraid of contamination. There's so many people around. Maybe I'm going to catch something from one of these other people. Or they maybe have more sort of suspiciousness of other people. Maybe other people are going to do something to me. Maybe I'll, if there's people are drinking too much, they'll become aggressive with me, or I'll get into a fight or something. Or maybe they have a drinking problem and they're worried. Maybe they've been successful at not drinking, and they're worried that they'll be tempted to drink there. So those are all other reasons why people might avoid a party. But in social anxiety, it's a fear that other people are going to judge me. They're going to find me boring. They're going to find me that they'll think I don't know what I'm doing. They'll think that I'm overly anxious. Those kinds of things. So we want people to just examine those predictions and try to figure out, is it something about the social aspects of the situation that's bothering me here? And even if you don't know exactly what it is, whether it's that they're going to think I'm boring or stupid or whatever, that's okay. It doesn't have to be. It may be a little bit more vague than that. That's okay. And then the other question is this the belief that this really matters. And here I would ask people to ask the question, what are the consequences if somebody judges me at this party? And what are the chances you can walk into a room with 100 people and nobody will judge you? The reality is going to be probably a few people who really enjoy talking to you. And there's going to be a few people who nothing bores them more than talking to you. And most people will be somewhere in between. And that's just a normal social experience. And is it okay if a few people judge me negatively? Is it possible not to be judged ever? If we think about the social psychology literature on what makes us like other people, one of the big factors is how similar they are to us. So we tend to like people who share our interests, who share our values, who come from the same place as us, who maybe do the same kind of job as us. And often when we meet people, we start looking for things we have in common right away. And that's one of the reasons I don't know if this is true, but I think that's one of the reasons we talk about the weather when we first meet people, because that's, when I'm not around other people, I don't care that much about the weather. But when you're with somebody else, that's something that you have in common. It's something that you can start with. Anyway, what that means, the fact that we tend to like people who are similar to us in some way, what that means is that we're going to be more likable to some people and less likable to others. And that's just the human condition. That's just the way it is. So striving to be liked by everybody is sort of setting yourself up for being disappointed because it's probably not going to happen. So helping people to recognize that and to ask that question, what if I do get judged? How can I cope with that? What if one of my conversations is kind of boring? Is that okay? So those are some additional, I went beyond your question, I guess. Your question is how do you identify the thoughts? But those are some additional questions for challenging those beliefs as well once you've identified them.
No, I'm glad you went beyond there. There was a lot of value, I think. So yeah, I think that's quite cleared up. So we can shift into the next sort of strategy if you're happy with that.
Sure. Yeah. So here I would challenge people who are listening to this right now to ask themselves, is there anything they used to be afraid of that they're not afraid of anymore? Probably all of us have something that we used to be afraid of that we're not afraid of anymore. And it may be the dark. Maybe when you were a child, you were terrified of the dark, but you're not anymore. Could be being at work. Maybe the first day you started at your job, you were really, really nervous, but now 10 years later, you're not. It could be dating. Maybe the first time you went on a date with your spouse, you were very, very anxious, but now after being married for 5 years or 20 years, you don't get nervous every time you see them. And I would ask people, why is that? And for a lot of people, they will recognize that, well, I just did it over, I went on more dates with this person until it got easier. I kept going to work every day and it got easier. Or I just gradually stopped sleeping with the light on and my fear of the dark got easier. And that's really what exposure therapy is all about. It's probably the most powerful way of reducing fear is to do the thing you're afraid of. And it's not just something that works for people, it's something that works for animals as well. So I had a dog who was afraid of going for walks when we got her. She was just a small puppy and she would just collapse on the ground with her stomach on the ground, her legs out, and she just refused to stand up even, let alone walk. And we would just pick her up and carry her a little bit farther each day. So she became familiar with the neighborhood. And over the course of a couple of weeks, she could walk anywhere. And that's without any cognitive strategies. We weren't challenging her thoughts or anything. It was just with pure exposure. So exposure is actually a powerful way of challenging thoughts. If you do something over and over again, it gets easier. Actually, I'm just thinking about where you are. You are really in the birthplace of behavior therapy. So a lot of the early people to do exposure-based therapies, people like Joseph Wolpe and Jack Rackman and others started in South Africa. Anyway, we now know that this is, again, a really powerful way of overcoming fear. Now, the way you do exposure seems to impact on the outcome. So, for example, if someone was afraid of snakes, I wouldn't just pick up a snake and throw it at them. That kind of exposure would make their fear worse. So we tend to do exposure in a way that's predictable. People kind of plan it in advance. They kind of know what they're going to do, and they anticipate possible challenges in advance and plan for those. The individual is always in control, especially early in the treatment, so that we don't force people to do anything that they're not ready to do. We encourage people to take steps. To practice exposures close together. If you spread it out too much, you won't see the benefit. If you're afraid of public speaking and you had to give a presentation once a year, you'd never get over that fear. Each time would be like starting over. But if you had to do it every day, if you were a teacher, for example, and had to teach your class every day, you'd find that it did get easier within a couple of weeks, probably. So we encourage people to practice exposures ideally on a daily basis, at least 4 or 5 times a week. And exposures also seem to work better if they're longer. So just going into a party for like 3 minutes and leaving, you're not going to get the same benefit as you do if you are there for an hour, or a couple of hours, or something like that. Over the course of a couple of hours, you learn that many of your predictions just don't come true. You don't have a chance to learn that in 3 minutes. The other thing that happens is over time, not always, but often the fear comes down when people are in the situation. And they learn that they can be there and not be anxious. If you leave after 2 minutes, what you learn is that when you're there, you feel really anxious, and when you leave, you feel better. So it kind of reinforces the escape behavior rather than the staying in the situation. So we really want people to stay in the situation long enough to challenge some of those predictions that they have. So those are a few suggestions for getting the most out of exposure. We also want people to reduce the use of what we call safety behaviors, and those are those little things that people do to protect themselves in the situation. So it could be having a few drinks before you go into a party. It may be sitting down during a presentation instead of standing up. It may be wearing lots of makeup to hide blushing, or wearing a really light t-shirt to avoid sweating. So all of those are examples of safety behaviors, and it's fine to use them early in your therapy journey, but over time, you want to gradually reduce the use of those. And all of this is generally, I forgot to mention this, but all of this is generally done gradually. So we wouldn't have people go into the worst situation they can think of. We'll often have them develop an exposure stepladder or hierarchy, which is just a list of situations rank ordered from not too bad at the bottom to really bad at the top. And we'd have them start with items that are manageable. We want them to be challenging, so they don't have to start right at the bottom of their list, but as high as they're willing to, and then gradually increase the difficulty of their exposures until they can do the things that are more difficult. And it gets easier over time. And if something's too difficult, that's okay. You can just try something easier. It's not that the only risk is that if you do something too difficult, the only risk is that you'll feel uncomfortable. It doesn't mean something bad is going to happen. So, and it's okay to be uncomfortable in situations. In fact, as soon as people are willing to be uncomfortable in situations, they'll be much more comfortable. A lot of this is driven by the desire not to be anxious and all of the effort that people put into not being anxious, which actually makes them more anxious. Mm-hmm. So that's exposure. Any questions or follow-ups on that?
Yeah, so I think I just might summarize that for the listeners. So for someone looking to work on the anxiety through exposure therapy, think about situations that you fear. Choose a situation that you can lean into that's not too anxiety provoking, but also not too easy. So there's sort of like a sweet zone where you're a bit anxious, but you're willing to engage in that activity. You should be in control. It should be practically safe, so that there's no backlash from it. And then do it frequently enough and long enough for your predictions to be challenged.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. Yeah.
Okay.
So should I move on to another strategy?
Yeah, I love that you have all these strategies ready. That's great. Yeah, please.
Great. So another piece that we use is social skills training, which is basically just learning to improve your interpersonal skills. So most of us anyway, this is certainly the case for me, I was not born a natural presenter or a natural public speaker. That's a skill that I had to develop over time. So, and that you can say the same thing of all kinds of different interpersonal skills, dating skills, how to start up a conversation, how to deal with conflict, how to give people negative feedback, how to be assertive, how to say no if you don't want to do something. Many people do just naturally have some of these skills, but for many of us, we need practice and we need to learn how to do these things. So that may also enhance, especially with social anxiety problems, people avoid situations, so they don't naturally get that practice necessarily. So they may be rusty in terms of some of these skills. So one of the things that our book, the Shyness and Social Anxiety Workbook, has a chapter on social skills training that basically helps people to identify areas where they may need some training or some practice in order to improve those skills. and then suggestions for how to get that practice. And a lot of it can just happen in the context of exposure. In fact, if you do enough exposure, you're going to get better at things because you're going to learn this works, this doesn't work, and your skills will improve. But just being a little bit mindful of that during your exposure practices, being aware of what worked and what didn't work can be useful. So, and there's lots of great books out there. There's a book called Messages by Matthew McKay and colleagues. It's all about improving interpersonal skills. So there's a whole chapter on assertiveness. There's a whole chapter on how to listen effectively to others. There's a whole chapter on public speaking. So with lots of tips on just how to be, how to get better at some of these things. So I'd encourage people to look at that book or other books. Again, there are entire books on how to speak effectively in public speaking and how to be assertive. So you can really delve into these topics if you want to. And just, and learning to improve those skills, which also will help to give people confidence in these situations. And now when I'm talking about social skills training, I also want to add the caveat that you also want to remember that it's not essential that you perform perfectly in these situations. So that's not what this is about. So it's fine to make mistakes. It's fine to not have your social skills be perfect across all of these situations. And in fact, that's impossible. The skills that might work well with some people are maybe not going to work that well with other people. So, and there's so many things that affect, if we think about something like eye contact, generally we encourage people to make more eye contact because a lot of people with social anxiety make less eye contact. But that's very much a Western kind of value. There are lots of cultures where eye contact means different things. People are taught to avert eye contact as a sign of respect in some cultures, for example. So all of that to say is that you're never going to get it perfect because there's these rules for how to behave socially are complicated, and none of us really, can master them completely. So we also, I think it's fine to work on trying to improve things, but you're never going to make everyone happy. Just one more example of this. I remember one of my early presentations after I finished my training was part of a job interview at a university where I had to give a presentation. And afterwards, I got feedback from the 100 or so students who attended. It was basically a teaching demonstration. And I remember very clearly going through the demonstrations and, this one looks positive, this one looks okay, this one looks okay. Oh, this person didn't like it. And what did they say? They said that I talked too quickly. And I thought, I must talk too quickly. And I went through a few more, they were okay. But then another one said I talked too quickly. I thought, I must definitely talk too quickly. After a few more, though, one person said I talked too slowly. And I thought, this is, what do I do with this? And after going through all of them, there were about 3 or 4 people who said I talked too quickly and 3 or 4 people who said I talked too slowly. And it was really after that experience that I realized that I'm never going to make everybody happy with my presentations. There's always going to be some people who wish I'd done more of something and other people who wish I'd done less of that exact same thing. So that's a helpful lesson that there's no perfect way to behave in these situations. On the other hand, though, if you haven't done much public speaking, there are probably a few little tweaks that you can make that will improve your public speaking, and for the average audience anyway. So that's social skills training. Any questions about that before I move on to another strategy? I'm mindful of the time. Are we okay to?
Yes. So I think in terms of the maybe I can just find out how many more sort of strategies would you like to discuss?
I was going to talk very briefly about mindfulness and acceptance-based strategies, and I thought I might just mention medication quickly at the end as well.
Great. I think let's go into that. I think anyone who wants to dive into social skills can just reference the books or anything else that you've mentioned.
That's great. So the mindfulness, basically, a lot of us, when we're anxious, we try to control our experiences. We try to control our feelings, control our thoughts. Mindfulness is a a sort of different approach, more of an acceptance-based approach, where when we are feeling anxious, if our hands are shaking and so on, rather than trying to control it or fight it, we basically let it happen. We encourage people to take a more present, focused stance, just focus on their experience in the moment, rather than dwelling on things they've said or done in the past, or worrying about the future. So just focusing on their experiences in the moment. And there are a number of different strategies that are taught. So one of them is meditation, for example, is a way of learning to be more present focused. Another sort of feature of mindfulness-based treatments is encouraging people to behave in a way that's consistent with their values. So a lot of people tend to behave in a way that's not consistent with their values. It may be very important for them to have close, meaningful relationships, and yet they end up avoiding the situations that make them anxious, so they're not able to have those relationships. So in mindfulness-based treatments, we teach people strategies for being more present-focused and for behaving in a way that's more consistent with what's important to them over time. And I don't have time to really get into much more detail about it, and it's also not my area. I come from more of a cognitive behavioral perspective, but there is evidence supporting it. In fact, I published a study comparing mindfulness-based treatments to cognitive behavioral therapy for social anxiety, and we found that both were equally effective. And my collaborators on this study, they were actually the leads on this study, were Nancy Kukovsky and Jan Fleming, and they have a book called the Mindfulness and Acceptance Workbook for Social Anxiety and Shyness. So if a mindfulness-based approach resonates with you and you're looking for an evidence-based approach that you can work through yourself, I would suggest their book. And again, I think, Jan Fleming, Fleming, is the first author, and Nancy Kukovsky, Kovski, is the second author. And again, it's the Mindfulness and Acceptance Workbook for Social Anxiety and Shyness. So that's all I'll say about that. And I just want to mention medication very quickly. There is evidence that medication is useful, particularly while people are taking it. So it turns out it's no more useful than the strategies we're talking about. So it's not that it's if your anxiety is really severe, that means you should take medication. They work equally well. And the combination of medication and psychological strategies for social anxiety tends to work about equally. It tends to be about as effective as either approach alone as well. So combining them is not necessarily more effective. I say not necessarily because those are average findings. For some people, medication may be the best option. For other people, psychological treatments are the best option. For some people, the combination may work best. But on average, they all seem to work about equally well in the short term. In the long term, we don't know much about social anxiety, but other types of social anxiety, other types of anxiety problems, we tend to see more relapse when people stop taking medication, whereas when people stop their therapy, they tend to maintain their gains much more. So as a long-term strategy, the psychological approaches that we've spoken about, on average, again, this is all for the average person, tend to be more effective. And if you're not sure, if you feel like you need something more than working through these things on your own, then talking about your case with a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a social worker or some other professional can help you to figure out what might be best for your situation.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, I think that's very valuable. Like, the mindfulness and acceptance, that firstly, that sounds almost like when you learn to focus on the present moment and the richness of the experience moment to moment and on what you value, it's almost like I imagine that expanding a bit, in your consciousness and leaving a bit less space for you to sort of go into the anticipation and the anxiety and the future-oriented thinking that might actually, is where maybe a lot of this anxiety lives.
Absolutely. And I think it does overlap with the cognitive behavioral strategies. So when you're focusing on acceptance, you're also changing your beliefs. You're changing the thought, I need to control my anxiety, to the thought, I don't need to control my anxiety. Nothing terrible is going to happen if I don't, if I let it happen. And you're also kind of doing some exposure. You're allowing yourself to experience these feelings rather than avoiding. You're doing things that are important to you, which is kind of like exposure as well. So I do think there are differences in the approaches, but I also think there's some overlap in the goal of ultimately of accepting anxiety and doing the things that are important to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. So I found it very interesting that if I go to the medication, just to wrap things up here, that they're sort of have the same effect, even if you put them together. I found that quite interesting. But I think maybe to wrap this up, I know you have to head out now. And for those listening, we've heard cognitive strategies, check in with those predictions that you're making. We've heard exposure strategies, leaning into those situations that are fearful. We've heard a bit about mindfulness and acceptance-based strategies and living in accordance with your values, giving that more time. And we've heard about medication, and then also some social skills training, where and if appropriate, without becoming too performative about it. So I think lots of value there. Thank you so much for being willing to share that. I think each one of these topics is so dense, so I feel like you've added a lot of value today. So where can people find out a bit more about you and the work you do?
I do have a website. It's martinantony.com, and Antony has no H, so it's martinantony.com. And I will mention there's you can learn about my books, including the Shyness and Social Anxiety workbook on my site. But I also want to mention that 5 of my books are available as free downloads. So they've gone out of print, but the rights reverted to me, and I just put them up on my website for people to download. And there is one on shyness and social anxiety. It's called 10 Simple Solutions to Shyness. And it's available as a free download from my website. And it's a little bit older. It's probably 2005 or 2004, something like that. But the strategies really haven't changed that much since then. So they're very similar to what I described today. So I think that book is still useful. It's a shorter book, so it doesn't go into as much detail. The Shyness and Social Anxiety workbook has much more kind of in-depth description of these strategies, and it's newer as well. But the 10 Simple Solutions, I say that's a good book for people who don't like to read. If you're looking for something that's a little shorter and just kind of gets at the core of it, that's a good book for that.
Yeah, for those listening, I'd encourage you to check out the website and make use of all those free downloads. Again, Dr. Antony, thank you for being here.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay.